السلام عليكم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد سيد الأولين والآخرين. مدد يا رسول الله، مدد يا سادة أصحاب الرسول، مدد يا مشايخنا دستوره ما شاء الله فأزداد سيد محمد الرحمن. مدد طريقتنا الصحبة والخير في الجمعية. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الله على كل شيء قدير. Allah Azze ve Celle'nin kudreti hadsız, husussuz, sonsuz.
There is no limit to Allah Almighty's power and might.
Doğru. Onun için insanların aklı onun kudretinin yanında aciz kalır.
People's minds cannot fathom the greatness and power and might of Allah Almighty, and people's minds are incapable of grasping even a slight notion of Allah Almighty's might and power.
Bazı insanlar işte bu ne için böyledir, bu nasıl oluyor?
People sometimes question why things happen and why things are the way they are.
Bu dünyada bu kadar zulüm oluyor.
And thus they ask why there's so much oppression in this world.
Nasıl Allah Azze ve Celle ne için şey yapmıyor, bunlara yardım etmiyor?
Why does Allah Almighty not prevent that? Why does Allah Almighty not support or help the oppressed ones? They ask.
O Allah Azze ve Celle her şey onun iradesiyle oluyor, onun kudretiyle oluyor.
Everything happens through the will of Allah Almighty, and everything occurs through the power and might of Allah Almighty.
Mümin olan, Müslüman olan insan, o da imandandır.
A believer, a Muslim who has faith, must believe in this.
İmanın Allah'ın her şeyine inanmak.
A believer must know that everything happens through Allah Almighty.
Allah Azze ve Celle'nin büyüklüğüne, azametine inanmak.
A believer must believe and have faith in the greatness and power and might of Allah Almighty.
Bizim vazifemizdir.
And this is what we are required to do.
Biz onu yaparsak rahat ederiz.
And if we have faith and trust and realize that everything happens through the power and might of Allah Almighty, we will find peace.
Öteki türlü sen kendi işine doğru dürüst yapamazken,
who are you to object Allah Almighty while you are so incapable of even managing your own business?
haşa Allah Azze ve Celle'nin işine mi karışacaksın?
Who are you to interfere with Allah Almighty's affairs while you are unable even to manage yourself?
Çok insanlar bilmeden cahillik yapıyorlar.
People commit acts of ignorance unknowingly.
Cahillik yapıp da bir de kendilerini akıllı zannediyorlar.
While they prove their ignorance through their acts of ignorance, they claim to be clever.
Bu kadar milyon milyar insan geçmiş.
Millions and billions of people have come to this world and have left this world.
Mümin geçmiş, Müslüman geçmiş.
And Muslims have come to this world, Mu'mins have come to this world.
Sen mi sırf akıllısın da
Are you the only clever one who knows how to do things?
bu hüküm, ahkam kesmeye kalkıyorsun?
Who are you to make judgments and decide on how things should be?
Onun için insan haddini bilmesi lazım.
One should know one's limits and boundaries.
Haddini bilmek büyük bir fazilettir.
To know one's boundaries, one's limits is a virtue.
Büyük bir iyiliktir.
And there's a blessing and great goodness in knowing one's limits.
Haddini bilmeyen insan her zaman, her vakit bir iyi bir şey bulmaz.
If you do not know your limits, if you trespass your boundaries, then you will not find goodness in no circumstance.
Dünyada da insanlar arasında haddini bilmeyeni haddini bildirirler derler.
And if you don't know your limits and boundaries among people in this world, then they will teach you a lesson and will make you know your limits.
Artık Allah Azze ve Celle insanın haddini bildirmeye tabi kadirdir.
And if you interfere with the affairs of Allah Almighty, and if you do not know your limits in front of Allah Almighty, then Allah Almighty is all powerful and all capable of making you know your limits.
Şüphe yok.
There is no about this. There is no doubt about this.
İnsan içine bu gelir, vesvese geliyor, yapıyor. O vesvese dışarı çıkmadıktan sonra bir şey değil ama
sometimes people have whisperings and they have doubts, but these are whisperings, those doubts, and as long as one does not make those doubts to be public, it will be forgiven.
Dışarıya çıkıp da millete şu böyledi, bu böyledi diyen insan onun haddini tövbe etmese Allah Azze ve Celle bildirir.
However, if you have doubts and then go public and tell others about how things should have been, if you make judgments, if you say things about how things should have been, and if you say this in public and make your thoughts and your doubts to be explicit, then you will be held accountable, and then Allah Almighty will make you know your limits, unless you ask Allah Almighty for forgiveness.
Pişman olur yaptığına. Onun için Allah Azze ve Celle'nin azameti sonsuz.
Then you will regret. You must know that Allah Almighty's power is endless,
Hadsiz, hudutsuzdur.
and there is no boundary to Allah Almighty's might and power.
Onun hiçbir şeyine bunu ne için böyle oldu diye ağzını açıp konuşma.
No one is entitled to open their mouth and to ask or question or object why things are the way they are and why Allah Almighty made things the way they are.
İçindeki vesvese sana kalsın.
Keep your whisperings and your doubts for yourself.
Vesvese herkeste var. Allah muhafaza eder.
And doubts and whisperings, this is something everyone suffers from, and keep them for yourself.
Ama dışarı çıktı mı o vakit onun tövbe etmedikten sonra hesabını cezasını bulur insan. Allah muhafaza etsin.
However, if you express your doubts and make it public and tell others about it and act based on them, then you will be held accountable before Allah Almighty, unless you ask Allah Almighty for forgiveness.
Vesveseden haddimizi aşmaktan Allah muhafaza etsin.
May Allah Almighty protect us from whisperings, from doubts, and may Allah Almighty protect us from trespassing our limits and boundaries.
Amin. Allah tevfik. El Fatiha.